We continue our coverage on the road to voting with only 4 days to go. Political parties today wrapped up their final rallies in an effort to convince voters. But despite all these efforts, there are many voters who are yet to decide on who they will support come the 29th of May. Now, to discuss this, I am now joined by political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, thank you so much for joining us this evening on News at Prime. I think it's fair to say that it's the 11th hour now, considering that voting will start on Monday with special votes. And if you don't know who you're going to vote for now, it is already crunch time. It's at the actual last hour. What's causing this confusion?
Good evening, Masai. Good evening to the viewers. And I think it's really the confusion of how people are feeling. I mean, I think we have to distinguish here between people want to vote. And I think that's a very important thing, that they want to exercise their right to vote. And I think it's very important that people want to be able to exercise that right to vote. So we wouldn't have had over 27 million people registering to vote in this election. So that's one clear distinction that we need to make, that there's a sense of civic participation, a duty, a right. People take it seriously. I think on the other end of the spectrum is really the challenge that people feel, particularly those that are still uncertain. According to certain polls that were released last week, you got around about 25% or just about a third of South Africans at some time not feeling as if they know who to vote for. And I think that confusion or that kind of complexity comes in from perhaps one, having a very, very pluralistic political spectrum. So you have more than 52 parties that will be contesting on the national compensatory ballot. Then of course you have a whole lot of parties out at the provincial level. And I think there's a general sense of what we've been hearing of distrust, apathy, just not feeling confident that anybody is talking to them, not necessarily talking past them. And I think that's what's happened in most of this campaign after the election date was announced and proclaimed by the president, that most of the political parties spoke not really speaking to the people, but spoke past them as if to say, well, what's your interest? Okay, I will do this for you. Or I will look at the polls and say, okay, it's unemployment, it's safety and security, it's housing, it's service delivery, it's issues around access to security, etc. And that has created this kind of uncertainty or this kind of apathy or this kind of distrust of institutions, because the experience that you have with an institution actually defines how you review or how you view that institution. So I think this confusion is really around the idea of, will my vote be as important to change what has been a status quo, or to change the fact that I have to sit in a queue for X amount of hours and still not be treated as a citizen? All of these things play in the mindset of citizens.
And also, speaking of that greater civic participation that we're seeing as well, with the increase in the number of people who are going to who've registered to go and vote come the 29th of May as well. It seems that voter confusion this time around seems to be the problem, not the apathy. When we looked at previous elections and voting, there was a lot of talk around voter apathy. And I think when we're seeing that increase of voter registration, it shows that there is that civic participation that's on the increase that you speak of as well. But touching on, the number of political parties that are out there, that are available for voters to vote for as well, would you say that we're a little bit spoiled for choice, which could also cause the confusion?
I would be more tepid in that response to you about spoiled for choice, because I think the choices out there are sometimes very confusing choices. At times, you're not sure whether the political party is really being coherent about what they are going to do. Yes, the manifestos are wonderful books to read and manifestos to look at. But I think the real problem is when you look at the manifesto and you look at what political parties are saying in their election rallies, you have to ask yourself this question: are you really being realistic? Can you really do what you say you're going to promise to do? And I think that's where the disconnects happen. I think the other issue around this question of civic participation, I think it's an inherent thing that we all have this sense of duty duty, the sense of wanting to vote in an election, because we know how important this election is, given that we are just 30 years old. I think we have to be also very clear that when we talk about the voter registration for this election increasing, we've got to also remember that there's about just under 13 million people who are eligible to vote, but have not decided that they're not going to vote, they're not going to register. So we have that kind of dilemma as well. The third point to make here is I think people are frustrated by the idea that when you ask about what is my interest, what is my material interest, how are you going to improve it, doubling the social grants, yes, it's a short-term win. Increasing the kind of pension grant, it's a short-term win. Building a university is a short-term win. You're going to clean up the issues around poor water. Well, you got to understand policy is not just made in a vacuum. Policy takes a lot of issues, a lot of bureaucracy, and a lot of decision making. And you can't just go in and say, I'm going to give you X amount of jobs if you don't understand that the economic growth trajectory of the country has been flat. And so where are you going to get those jobs? How are you going to get those jobs? And this is where policy understanding and policy astuteness becomes very important. And I think what happens with ordinary South Africans is that they know that. They know that some of these transactional promises that are made by political parties come to the fold because it's about a vote. The vote is almost that kind of holy grail. But then 5 years after that, you don't see these people. Suddenly now you're seeing them in your backyard, you're seeing them at rallies, they're all around, they're knocking on your doors. But the problem with this kind of transactional approach to electoral democracy is that there needs to be some level of accountability, I think, to prevent political parties from making reckless statements and so making false promises to people.
Yeah, and I think that's been a major concern for particularly people who are confused about who to vote for as well, because lots of promises are being made as well, and some, have even dubbed manifestos as a wish list because it's not even binding. And if you're one of those people who is feeling confused about who to vote about come Wednesday, Sanusha, how would you advise those people to end up making their decision? What should you be factoring in?
For me, I would say that when I take myself in this whole process, I'm asking myself, how do I want to vote? Bottom line is, I am going to vote. The question is how I'm going to vote. And that's the bigger challenge, or that's the bigger existential question for me, because how I'm going to vote means I've got 3 ballot papers. I have to vote for a national compensatory ballot. I've got to vote on a regional compensatory ballot, which is essentially the seats from the provincial to the National Assembly. And then, of course, I've got to vote for a province. And for me, the bigger challenge is, do I just vote one party on all 3 ballot papers, or do I split it around? Or do I actually then be the kind of participant and citizen where I feel that maybe in Parliament, I want the ANC and the DA to work closer together. I want more accountability, more transparency, more oversight. And so maybe there is where I think about splitting my vote. I'm not saying I'm doing this. I'm just giving you some permutations of how things be. And I think this idea that the electorate will split their vote, they may do that. They may actually want, for the first time, we may end up in a situation where Parliament becomes a real game changer, because the permutation that unpacks in Parliament is that you can have a national coalition, but you can also have a situation in Parliament where political parties are not able to push their agenda further than they can. They have to now start thinking about the number of seats they get, and of course how that splits on the regional ballot will be very important. And then of course you have to think about who you want at the provincial level. So I actually feel that this is an interesting election for me, because it'll be it's unclear what party what voters would do with those 3 ballots. Will they go X to the same party, or will they say, right, let's mix it up and let's make it a little more exciting, because this is where transparency can be put forward, but also where accountability can happen. Remember, legislation in Parliament has to go through a particular vetting process, a particular process around committees, and that's where it has to happen. So I think for me, I know how I want to vote, but what happens in my mind is, the way I want to vote, I always ask myself is that the best impact for this democracy in consolidating it. And that's going to be key. Last point, Masai, that I want to make on this, and that is we have to also think about the number of valid ballots that will be counted. And if indeed we start to see invalid ballot papers that can't be counted, that also shifts the turnout. So you can have turnout at X amount, but if the valid papers that are counted and you have a section of them that are invalid, then you must also remember that changes the dynamic as well. Maybe not as big, maybe it'll be negligible, but definitely has an impact. So I think we're going into an election that's both about the technical, the operational, but also about the substantive. And bottom line is the electorate is going to say, well, who best represents me right now?
Yeah. And is it possible, I have a twofold question here, is it possible to find a representative who best represents you fully, completely? Or is it going to be one of those things where you kind of have to choose somebody who has the majority of the things that you're looking for, but not all of them perhaps? And that's one part of the question. But then on that other option of splitting the vote as well, we've heard political party leaders saying, don't do that, rather give us all three of your X's. And of course, we know why they would say that. But that is also a viable democratic option for people who are a little bit confused right now to actually split the vote.
Yeah, I mean, in your second option, I think people, this is about people deciding how they want to vote, and nobody should basically prescribe or be prescriptive on how these individuals should vote. If they want to vote all three parties, the same party on all three ballot papers, that's their right to do. If they want to split their vote, that's their right to do. But I guess what we're beginning to see here is that there may be that entry that we're having now, that kind of bringing up the space in our electoral process where people will start to think about who best works at the national level, who best works in parliament, and who best works at provincial level. So you're kind of starting to create a kind of a triumph of different configurations. And these configuration of circles that you are thinking about is, I like the ANC at the national level. I think the DA does well as an accountability actor and stakeholder as opposition in parliament. And of course, I feel that the province in KZN or in Gauteng or in Western Cape is best run by maybe, I like a coalition here. So this election gives you a lot of carte blanche. It gives you a lot of permutations to play around with. But again, the challenge is people can do that if they understand what their intention is and what they want to achieve out of it. If they're not clear about that, then it ends up getting caught up in a situation where you may have to deal with spoiled ballots. And spoiled ballots will also impact in terms of whether they have a big impact on how many votes that have been spoiled will impact on valid votes that will then determine the seats in parliament.
And I really hope this conversation will also help those who have been confused about who to vote for and make things a lot clearer. So thank you so much, Sanusha.
Yeah.